It was carnage, the worst violence in Sri Lanka since the end of the civil war 10 years ago. Multiple church and hotel bombings on Easter Sunday that killed more than 200 people. In the immediate aftermath, the government shut off access to social media, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and Viber. The rationale: to stem the spread of hate speech and misinformation. However, there's a complex debate to be had here on the benefits of a social media shutdown versus the costs. Millions of people could not contact their friends and family because in Sri Lanka, social media platforms are the internet itself, such as the online reliance on sites like Facebook and WhatsApp. Moreover, the evidence suggests that shutting off social media does little to check the spread of misinformation. Circumvention is all too easy, and the blocks cut off authentic sources of information as well. And in a country where politicians and the mainstream media have been known to deal in misinformation themselves, an internet shutdown makes it harder to get to the truth. Our starting point this week is the Sri Lankan capital, Colombo.
So the first explosions occurred around 8:45 on Easter Sunday morning. Within minutes, the first images started flowing through social media networks.
Some of the first photos came clearly from members of the congregation. They were horrific and graphic.
We started getting, dozens of WhatsApp messages through various groups, trying to figure out what had happened. Lots of speculation and rumors that didn't end up being true.
And then around midday, one by one, WhatsApp stopped functioning. Facebook was not loading, Instagram was not, and also YouTube and Snapchat. So social media platforms were not working anymore.
Within 6 hours of the coordinated explosions across Sri Lanka, allegedly by a group that had pledged allegiance to ISIS, the social media shutdown came into effect. The online information vacuum was in place. There was no official warning, and the justification was slow in coming. Still, the measures came as no surprise to outsiders, social media observers and commentators around the world. With misinformation and hate speech spreading across online platforms, the block seemed to make sense, just not to those actually affected, Sri Lankans.
When I see this on Western media, what I see is someone going, oh yeah, Sri Lanka just blocked Facebook because of hate speech. Facebook needs to get its act together. In reality, these are not democratic decisions. What happens is the Sri Lankan government just pulls off a block. It's someone's knee-jerk reaction, and people just have this void of information.
You have to sort of weigh the risks that come with social media and how it can be used to sort of incite violence and further violence, which Sri Lanka has seen in the past. However, in Sri Lanka, most folks actually communicate through apps like WhatsApp and Viber. And when you block those apps, it makes it very hard to access information about what's going on. And the fact that the news was being broken through social media rather than through official media channels first, and without any government statements right away, I think caused people to really sort of panic.
Beyond the question of whether a social media blockage is in the societal interest is the question of how effective blockages are, particularly in a tech-savvy country like Sri Lanka, where the use of VPNs, virtual private networks, has grown widespread. Just over a year ago, in March of 2018, the government attempted its first social media block after anti-Muslim violence erupted in central and eastern Sri Lanka. More than 1 million social media users reportedly downloaded VPNs, which circumvent blockages by masking a user's location, allowing them to go online from what appears to be another country. So when this blockage occurred, many Sri Lankans were ready.
Everybody has VPNs in the country. Most everybody that I know has a VPN installed on their smartphone or devices and computers. And so the first thing that people talk about when they get a hint that the government is trying to block social media is what VPNs you should download and that you should do it immediately. So I'm not sure about the effectiveness of a block in a context where VPNs are so broadly debated and discussed.
But the day after the attacks, TunnelBear, one of the most popular VPNs in Sri Lanka, was no longer accessible. Sri Lankans who circumvent the social media blockage do not deny that online discourse can be problematic or even dangerous. The fabrications, misinformation, and the hate speech are there for all to see. However, ethnic and religious divides have always existed in the country. Social media just gives them a prominence across multiple platforms they've never had before.
We started seeing fabrications of pretty much everything. The water hoax in particular, where people started receiving messages that water in Hunupitiya was poisoned. And we found that within an hour, there were vehicles going up and down on the roads of these areas, telling citizens not to drink their water, that this had actually been poisoned. There were fake bombings reported.
Army headquarters එකට දැනුම් දීලා තියෙනවා යුද්ධාංශයෙන් ඉන්දියාවේ. හරිද? එතකොට මේ ටවුන් එක කොහෙද කියලා නැහැ. ලොකු බ්ලාස්ට් එකක්.
So you can imagine the kind of shock that must have done to people.
Social media, while a tool that was used and has been used to incite hatred and violence in Sri Lanka, is by no means the cause of such hatred and violence. If you look at the history of Sri Lanka since independence, we've had cycles of violence and cycles of riots even. And while I can see the fact that apps like Facebook and even WhatsApp and Viber have been used by, far-right extremist groups to kind of propagate a certain narrative around the Muslim community, they by no means are the sort of cause of violence. And I think blocking of those apps is not going to result in an end to violence against the Muslim community.
Sri Lankans would be less dependent on social media if they had more faith in their mainstream news outlets, but they do not. Call it the Rajapaksa effect. Mahinda Rajapaksa was the country's president from 2005 to 2015. Under his watch, journalists faced heavy government pressure and some paid for their work with their lives. In 2009, Reporters Without Borders directly blamed the president and state-owned media for inciting hatred and violence against journalists. Rajapaksa was voted out of office in 2015, providing news outlets with some breathing space. However, late last year, his successor tried to bring him back as prime minister. That led to a legal standoff lasting 51 days over what came to be known as Sri Lanka's soft coup. Most mainstream news outlets supported the return of Rajapaksa.
ශ්‍රී ලංකා ඉතිහාසයේ නොමකැන සටහන් තැබූ ජනාධිපතිවරයෙක් හැටියට ප්‍රථාස්ත දේශපාලඥයෙක් හැටියට ඔහු පිවිසෙන්නේ තවත් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ අලුත් පිටුවක් පෙරලන්නට විය හැකියි.
Eventually, the courts overturned Rajapaksa's appointment, ruling that it was unconstitutional.
That made us realize that our media is no longer serving the public interest. It is serving vested interests. Our newspapers, our radio and television, with a few honorable exceptions, are all captured. There is much that is not right with social media, but the web and social media is also the last space left for us to verify and us to find out and us to express.
Social media also played an important role again in trying to be very critical of how the coup was being conducted, in exposing the kind of bribery attempts that were being made by the sort of newly formed coup government. Social media was really important in all of that.
I shudder to think what could have happened if there was no social media or it was blocked during the 51 days of that crisis. The coup could have succeeded, and that's the problem. Media is compromised, media is captured, and they have abdicated their public interest remit. This is sad but realistic assessment of our traditional or mainstream media.
Sri Lanka's social media blockage was supposed to have ended by now. But on Friday, President Maithripala Sirisena said there is still too much misinformation out there. And if the platforms fail to control it, they may be banned permanently. Under the declared state of emergency, the government also has the power to censor mainstream news outlets. Far from seeing the end of misinformation, Sri Lankans have been left with a lack of information.